afternoon.
Good afternoon.
We're glad to see so many of you here. Some of you have come to other talks and presentations, and I want to make a few announcements. First of all, for our students in my class, the attendance sheets that you need to sign are on the back row. Make sure your name is on it, because I won't be able to remember each and every one of you without a list. Secondly, there are refreshments in the back, including coffee, tea, and I forget what else, and etc. And it's the duty of each one of you to consume some of that, so there won't be any left over. So please do your best to make it vanish, all the food, as much as possible. And it's a pleasure to have so many of you here, when I'm sure there are other events and activities that you might be attending. I'd like to make the introduction brief because Mr. Baker is a fascinating speaker and has lots to tell us about things. There are photographs and other materials in the back that you can take a look at eventually. And then, of course, we have both a drawing and a replication of the drum slate when they were trying to elect representatives to office in the United Automobile Workers. And there are many things that I'd like to tell you about Mr. Baker, one of which is in 1965, the draft board in the local area attempted to draft him into the Army. He first wrote him a letter, and then secondly, he went down and told him, I'm not going. And he expected to be arrested and tried, but they decided that they would be better off leaving the man alone. And that has perhaps set the tone for many other things that he did when black workers at the Dodge main plant felt that they were not being properly treated. He and others decided to have a strike without bothering to contact the United Automobile Workers in advance. And he will tell you many of the details, but I wanted to indicate this is a man of uncommon courage, uncommon insight, and determination. So, Mr. Baker, if you'll come forward.
Thank you, Dr. Dykes. Listen, I want to thank the class for having this opportunity to come here and talk with you here and try to express some of the struggles and fights that we've been through. And I know over the last 30 years, I've only spoken at Oakland University one other time. But I've been other places speaking because the drum movement that we created in the 60s has been quite popular. There's about 5 or 6 different books written on this drum struggle. The one I have here is one called Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, that's in its 3rd print. There's another one called Who's Detroit by Heather Thompson. Another called Race, Class, and Worker Insurgency by Gertzwinder. And it's a couple others. So there's a lot of books and literature out on the struggles in the auto workers in the 60s. I think one of the most important things that we need to know is I think Detroit is probably the most studied city in America when it comes to trying to deal with the contradictions of race and class. I mean, there are people down in Detroit right now digging up more stories about these struggles and how they unfolded, and new books coming out in the fall. You know, so it's a lot of rich history there down in the city, and that's why I'm so happy to be able to come to this campus to make a presentation. We have large files of stuff down in the Ruther Library, in labor files and civil rights files down there, documenting this movement and struggle. One thing I want to do is point out that that's my wife sitting right there, Marion Kramer, and she's the national president of the Welfare Rights Union, and we've been in these trenches together for the last 33 years. So these so these struggles are not just male-orientated, they're family struggles. We got, 8 daughters and 1 son and 6 grandchildren.
We only have 7 daughters.
7 daughters. I done counted them wrong. I want to tell you the story of drum. First of all, I'm homegrown. I was born in Detroit in 1941. My parents were sharecroppers from Georgia. They came north with the call for Ford Motor Company to get the $5 a day jobs. I was fortunate enough, I was telling Professor Dykes a little earlier, that I'm not sure how many people know about the Dr. Sweet's case in Detroit. Anybody familiar with Sweet's case? Okay, okay. Well, Dr. Sweet delivered me. I put a copy of my birth certificate on that panel in the back so you can see Dr. Ocean Sweet's signature. So I guess I got a kind of a legacy in that regard because Dr. Sweet was such a famous figure in the city of Detroit. For those that don't know much about him, you know, he was a doctor that decided that he wanted to buy a home on Kercheval and Garland Street in Detroit. That was an all-white community in 1920s. He bought the house and whites surrounded his house. He took a core of friends of his and his brother and his family into the house. They were armed. The whites on the outside attacked the house and shots were fired. I think one person killed, another wounded. They were all arrested. The NAACP at that time didn't have its own attorneys, so they would hire an attorney. They hired the famous Clarence Darrow. Most of you familiar with Clarence Darrow? Yeah, he was the attorney from the Swoops case or the monkey trials out of Texas around evolution. Tennessee, on evolution. So Darrow came in. Frank Murphy, well, at that time was the judge in the court in Detroit. The Sweets family drew an all-white jury. Clarence Darrow's closing argument, from what I can understand, was 22 hours long, and he got an acquittal for O.C. and Sweet in that case. It was a landmine victory, really important. It's a real nice story written on it, I think, called The Ark of Deliverance by Boyle, I think, one of the books. Yeah, so it's a couple of good stories written about that, and the O.C. and Sweet house still stands on Kercheval and Garland and has a state monument there in front of it, but he's an historic figure, and I just honored that he slapped me on my behind when I first came in there. So I wanted to mention that. I want to say this. I guess before we got to the drum movement in the late 60s, and I grew up in Detroit like everybody else did. Detroit was really the Motor City, and when they say the Motor City, I just want to say a few things about its history. You know, Detroit's auto history is only about a little over 100 years old. And most people don't know that. I mean, most people think like it's been automobiles there forever. But at the turn of the century in 1900, Detroit was the stove-making capital of the country. They made iron stoves. And I don't know any of you are familiar with Detroit. They used to have one big iron stove sitting at the Belle Isle entrance. I think they later moved that big iron stove over to the State Fairgrounds. I'm not sure where it is now. I'm not sure. It may still be at the State Fairgrounds, but at that time, Detroit was the leading maker of iron stoves in the country. So obviously, the auto industry and its introduction came quickly, and looked like from what we got left, it done left quickly, because we got a whole lot of automobile plants that are not here no more. But you got to understand how many plants was in Detroit. I mean, one I like to talk about. Has anybody in here seen a Packard lately? A Packard car lately? Well, you know, the reason I want to say that because we got the Packard plant sitting down here in the middle of Detroit like a big eyesore. The last Packard ran off the line in 1955, and the Raggedy factory is still sitting over on the east side on Grand Boulevard. I mean, I guess they just gonna let us live with this thing until we die. But that just shows you one of the institutions that's gone. We used to have Hudson and Fraser, Kaiser, Studebaker, the old Rambler that used to be the car of Romney's father, you know, when he ran American Motors. So it's a whole lot of automobiles that used to be made that ain't made no more, and they're going off the face of the earth. But back in the middle of, to try to give you an understanding of how important the auto industry was, I got a picture back there of a couple of old guys I was hanging with, one named Dave Moore, who died a couple of years ago, was 97 years old, and he was the last living survivor of the Hunger March in 1932. And he was so articulate, and he'd tell me all these stories about what they went through. But I think the most important story I had to get in my head is how Detroit became the arsenal of democracy. And he talked about in 1941, right after Ford Motor Company was organized in April of that year, and Pearl Harbor came about in December, and the United States declared war against Japan and Germany and entered the war wholesale, that it wasn't a single new car built from 1941 to 1945. And I challenge anybody to go find one. But the entire auto industry was converted to war production. And I used to hear that story all the time. I didn't necessarily take to heart what all it meant. But what happened was that the government guaranteed to auto companies the cost of production plus 10% profit. And based on that, the auto companies hired a bunch of people. But the reconversion into war production meant that those plants went online working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Detroit never slept. And when they told me that, I had to sit there and listen. They said, listen, streetcars never quit running. They had to open up theaters, movie theaters downtown all the time and restaurants and things because the city never slept. 24/7, and all for war production. And so you kind of get a picture of how busy this city was, what the arsenal of democracy meant. As people, the borders were closed for foreign immigrants, so during this period of time, you had all the migrations from Appalachia and the Deep South pouring into Detroit to fill these jobs. So that's a picture of what the auto industry looked like at that period of time. And we had all discriminating features that went with that. One of the stories he told me was the fact that over on Livernois and Warren in Detroit was the old DeSoto plant, and they built army trucks, to go to the army bases. They had army trucks, he told me, lined up from 8 Mile all the way back down to 4th Street of trucks parked there that they couldn't get to the army bases because Jimmy Hoffa, at that time, who was president of the Teamsters Union, didn't allow blacks to drive over the land trucks. So all these trucks were backed up, white workers driving them back and forth, killing themselves, wearing themselves out to get these trucks to the bases. They had to appeal to Eleanor Roosevelt in order to break the stranglehold to allow blacks to help drive those trucks to get them to the army bases. But I just trying to give you a picture of Detroit and what was taking place at that time and the struggles that we were confronted with. And you can document some of this stuff because I got some books and references to the way the Teamster Union was organized. So I'm just giving you that little bit of background. I had my own personal development. I finished high school in 1958, and I graduated from Southwestern High School. And if any of y'all from Detroit, you'll know they just announced the other day they're fixing to close my high school. So it's going to become part of history under the new emergency manager there. You just decided to kill that school. I want to go on to say that when I finished high school in 1958 was the most difficult years of my life at that time. That's the first time I ever saw commodity cheese was in 1958. In 1958, after the end of the Korean War, the whole auto industry almost collapsed in this city. By 56 and 57, there were massive layoffs at all the auto plants. I think 1958 was the year that Ford came out with the famous Edsel car. And the Edsel, before recently, had the most disgraceful introduction of any car before. It was the biggest flop in history. But anyway, things were so bad that me and my father would go out looking for work together in 58. And the auto industry really didn't pick back up, until 1962 and 63 when they started hiring after the Kennedy election in 1960 and the beginning outbreaks of the Vietnam War. So we had a real difficult time in Detroit during those periods of time. I have sections of my family that live in Akron, Ohio, because when Chrysler laid them off in 57, the first call they got back was in 1962 in Twinsburg, Ohio. So they had to transfer to Twinsburg, Ohio to take jobs after being laid off for almost 6 years. And I got a whole section of the family that stayed down there after that. But I just try to give you a picture of how devastating the layoffs was and how bad things were. I entered Highland Park Community College back at that period of time, and I started getting a little bit of a political education then. At this time, by the time you get to 58, 59, civil rights movement is picking up. You got demonstrations at Woolworth stores that's beginning. You got the Freedom Riders that's prepared to start freedom rides. all over the country. So I'm starting to get a little bit of my education in the process of this struggle itself. It was at this time in history, my first open political activity was I got a chance to march with Dr. King down Detroit in 1963. That was obviously the biggest march I'd ever been in. Walter Reuther and other labor leaders were on the front row. You didn't actually have to march. You pretty much got pushed all the way to Jefferson if you got on Woodward Avenue, because the crowd was that big. I think the estimates that we had over 100,000 people in the march in Detroit. It was a significant march because it was on Sunday evening. All the ministers participated, and all the churches led out and joined the march, down Detroit. So that was my introduction into what I consider the civil rights movement as a whole. So I became part of the civil rights or social movement before I became part of the trade union movement. At that time, I was still working at Woolworth's 5 and 10 cent store making $1.10 an hour. But I got hired in 1963 at Ford Motor Company in September, and we used to, if you were a young male growing up in the city of Detroit, you were going to go to one of these auto plants sooner or later. And we used to call it baptism. So I got baptized at the Ford Motor Company Dearborn Stanford plant in 1963 as a heavy press operator, making $2.73 an hour. That was my introduction into the auto industry. So now I'm still part of this social or civil rights struggle, now I'm part of the trade union movement. So that was my introduction into those early struggles. I want to say, like Dr. Dykes earlier, my participation in the civil rights movement led me to the opposite side of the civil rights movement than the side that Dr. King represented. Most people have this history backward, They say the polarity in the black community was Dr. King on one end and Malcolm X on the other. Malcolm X was a militant, and obviously Dr. King was for nonviolence. But that's not the case. The real dynamic was a leader called Robert Franklin Williams, out of Monroe, North Carolina, who came back from the military in 1955 and went to his little hometown in Monroe, North Carolina, and he got elected as the president of the NAACP chapter. Once elected the NAACP chapter, all the middle class people quit. All the doctors and teachers and all quit the NAACP, so he stuck up here with a chapter, so he had to build him a chapter, so he went to the pool halls and laundromats and built him a working class chapter of the NAACP in Monroe, North Carolina. So when the civil rights freedom riders got to coming to Monroe, and the Ku Klux Klan in Monroe decided to organize, and start to harass these freedom riders that were coming through there, what Robert Williams did was write to the National Rifle Association and ask for a charter. And they gave him a charter for the National Rifle Association. And he took that charter and built him a rifle club in the middle of his NAACP chapter. And when the Ku Klux Klan got ready to ride in North Carolina, they set up sandbags on the street, opened fire on the Ku Klux Klan, and the Klan never rode back through Monroe, North Carolina. And that's a story you don't hear. But that was Robert F. Williams. And they have got books and movies out about him. I got one right here called Negroes with Guns. It was printed by Wayne State University, and that's the story of Robert Williams and his chapter. Obviously, they kicked him out of the NAACP. They said you can't have no rifle chapter in the NAACP chapter. So the national organization kicked him out, but he stayed strong with his little chapter in the rifle club down in Monroe, North Carolina. So what happened with Robert was one day when the Klan had said they was going to ride, he had a white couple that drove through the city that was lost. He took that couple in his house to keep them for protection because they were lost. And after the Klan didn't ride, they let them go. As soon as they done that, the FBI came after him for kidnapping charges. So they had pictures of Robert Williams in every post office in America. Wanted dangerous for kidnapping. Robert and his family was able to get out of the country. He got up to New York and got to Toronto, and he had went in 1959. right after the Cuban Revolution, Robert Williams had went to Cuba on the invitation of the Cuban government. And when he got down there, he said that Fidel had came to one of the meetings and said, I hear we got somebody here from the South. Most of the people, Leroy Jones and Julian Mayfield and the rest of them was Northern writers, but Fidel had asked him about that, and Robert said, hey, I'm from the South, and he told him, well, someday you may need sanctions. You can always got a home here in Cuba, because I know what the South is like for blacks there. Anyway, Robert Williams was able to call the Cuban embassy in Toronto, and he got free passes to Cuba. So him and his two kids and his wife all went to Cuba. Matter of fact, Robert Williams' wife and son still live here in Detroit today. But the reason I want to tell you the story is because Robert Williams started a radio show from Cuba called Radio Free Dixie. And it's a book called Radio Free Dixie that talks about his show. And we used to get together at my little apartment when I was in Highland Park, and we'd tune in and pick up Robert Williams broadcasting from Cuba, and it was fantastic. 1963, and they would come on talking about white man's nigger no more and truth crushed to the earth shall rise again. It's 1963. We were just traumatized by his expressions and his struggle for uprising and for us to fight back. So that was the education I had early on. And so I began the movement kind of like that, you know. He also had a little newsletter called The Crusader that used to come through the country, and we'd pass it out various places that Rob tried to, I think he was a real influence on the Deacons for Self-Defense in Jonesboro, Louisiana, that my wife was working with down there. But he kind of influenced, he was an influence to the Panther Party early on because of the resistance that he preached. So anyway, I just wanted to try to tell you that kind of background. So I had that kind of background information. Meanwhile, I transferred from Highland Park Community College to Wayne State University, and we set up a little organization on Wayne State's campus called Uhuru. Uhuru was Swahili for freedom. We didn't do much on that campus because there wasn't much we could do. Our strategy was to try to take the resources the university had that put at our disposal and try to use those, you know, to organize and stuff in the community. The first thing we had was that we got arrested for booing during the playing of the national anthem when Detroit was trying to get the Olympic Games here in 1963. Now listen, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this story, but look at what would happen. We lost that struggle. We didn't get the Olympic Games. This was trying to get the Olympic Games in '68. But the meeting was being held in '63, you know, because they do that about 4 or 5 years earlier, preparing for the next Olympic Games. But had the Olympic Games came to Detroit in 1968, do you know what a mess we'd have had on our hands? We lost the struggle, and the Olympic Games went to Mexico. But that's when Tommy Smith and Carlos and them protested on the polls. That's 6 months after Martin Luther King was shot down in 1968 in April. We would have had a mess on our hands had the Olympic Games came here. But we were protesting because the Detroit City Council had just turned down an open occupancy law. We didn't even have an open occupancy law in the city of Detroit in 1963, and we're trying to get Olympic Games coming to here. We still had these white citizens organizations that control who could live in which neighborhood in the city of Detroit. We hadn't even had our first one black councilman, William T. Patrick, that was elected, I think, in 1961. But that's the level of control we had of the city. Anyway, I just wanted to give you that kind of background, but that's one of the activities we were involved in. What happened was that, and I didn't bring it, I wanted to, but I couldn't get it together right, but in 1962, Cuba was added to one of the countries on the U.S. passport that you could not travel to. Now, I don't know if you ever looked at your old passport or seen some of this stuff on it, but the countries you couldn't go to at that time was China, Korea, Vietnam, Albania, and then Cuba was added to the list in 1962. So the Cuban Federation of Students sponsored a group tour to Cuba of 63 American students to come to Cuba in defiance of this new law. So in 1963, a group of 63 students went to Cuba. The next year, the same thing happened where the Cubans were trying to get another group to come, and this time they had demanded that they wanted some more African American students to go. So they contacted our little group down at Wayne State, and 4 of us went to Cuba. And I got to mention this because Cuba, the kind of trip to Cuba kind of helped change my life, I think, open my eyes to a different way. But when you got a letter saying that you'd been rejected for the trip, that meant you'd been accepted, you know. So we got accepted for the trip, the 4 of us. We were given instructions to travel in pairs, in 2. We had to slip out of the country. I couldn't even tell my family where I was going. My dad told me if he found out I was going to Cuba, he was going to tell on me. So I said, well, I ain't going to tell you. That's the way we'll deal with that. So anyway, we were told to get a Greyhound bus to Chicago and get a room at the Piccadilly Hotel in Hyde Park, which we did. We got there, we traveled in pairs of 2, and then we were called and told to get a cab to the train station downtown, Union Station in Chicago. We did that. Once there, we met a contact and we got a cab to the airport. We got a flight to Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, we was given first-class plane tickets to Paris, France. Once we got in Paris, France, then we met all the rest of the students. Some had left from San Francisco and LA and New York, different times in Paris, and all 84 of us met in France. Once in France, we caught another Air France jet to Czechoslovakia. In Czechoslovakia, we got a Cuban plane, and the Cuban plane took us to Ireland, Newfoundland, and back down to Cuba. So I went halfway around the globe trying to get 90 miles from home. But Cuba was a revolutionary laboratory. I'd done everything in Cuba. I learned so much in Cuba. Let me say, first of all, we played baseball with Fidel Castro. We met with Che Guevara. We met Muhammad Babu, who led the revolution in Zanzibar before Zanzibar and Tanganyika became one that's now known as Tanzania. We met revolutionary fighters from Rhodesia in South Africa who had been wounded in the freedom fights and were in Cuba convalescent. It was just a revolutionary laboratory. I couldn't understand it. We spent all our time pretty much, I'm 22 years old. I don't know much, so I'm just trying to learn things and stumble my way through stuff. But we're looking at the U.S. passport and said, well, look, all these countries you can't go to, must be something good about these countries. So let's go see each one of them. So we went and met with the Chinese, we met with the Koreans, met with the Vietnamese, and all of these countries, they were non-white communist countries, except this little country, Albania. I said, well, where did this Albania come from? So we go to meet with the Albanians, and we sit down there meeting with them, and they told us that they've been fighting imperialism since Julius Caesar. I said, my goodness, I damn near fell over the chair backwards, you know. But anyway, I mean, that's just a little rudimentary education we were getting in the course of this struggle. One of the main emphasis that we went there for was Robert Williams was in Cuba. And he was in Cuba, and we got a chance to sit down and meet with him and talk about how he organized what he called the Black Guards in Monroe, North Carolina. That was the fighting forces that they had to build up against the Ku Klux Klan. You know, so we met with him in that sense. So that's how I got my early education in a lot of ways, you know, stumbling through history like that, you know. I didn't start off going that way, but that's the direction I got directed to. So when I got back, Professor Dykes was telling me they sent me a letter to the draft board, told me to come down for my physical for the draft board. So I sat down and wrote them a long letter saying I'm not coming for the physical. I know I'm physically fit, but I'm not joining this army. You know, and then I went on to tell them why. The fight against the Vietnamese and all these other people all over the globe, the intervention in the Congo early on around Lumumba, and all these other stories. And I ended up telling them, but I'm a fighting person and I got morals. And I believe that when the call is made to free South Africa, send for me. When the call is made to free Rhodesia, send for me. When the call is made to free most of the Latin American countries from United Fruit Company sent for me. And when the call was made to free Mississippi and South Carolina and 12th Street here in Detroit, sent for me and I'll be the first one in line. So I sent them that letter, and they responded in kind and sent me a letter saying, well, you draft dodging. So I got my letter and went down to the draft force and said, I'm not dodging, I'm just not going. So I went on home and thanks, baby. When I went on home and then they drafted me anyway. So they set my draft date for September 10th, 1965. So our little group that I told you about, Uhuru, we changed the whole name of the group to the September 10th movement. So we named the group after my induction date. And we developed one main slogan. It was destroy the draft, you know, and we started mobilizing all over the city, you know, in workplaces and students, you know, building an anti-draft movement in this country. And so on the date I went in for induction. Now back on that board, I got a picture that I got out of the state police files when they sent them out. And you'll see me walking into the induction center. They got a number 1 wrote on my back. And they got a picture of me in the demonstration that we had once I came out. So when I went in the induction center, I thought I was going to jail. I had my toothbrush in my pocket. Back then, at that time, every time we got ready to go to jail, we'd always put a toothbrush in your pocket because when you got arrested, you could never brush your teeth. They used to give you free cigarettes. They used to give you some roll rice and some cherry chip tobacco so you could roll your cigarette and smoke, but you could never get no toothbrush till you finally got a visit and somebody brought you one. So whenever we thought we was going to jail, we used to carry a toothbrush in my pocket. So I had my brush in my pocket that day. And anyway, I got to the point in the process where you swear in, and I told them I'm not going no further, and if you don't like it, you better call the police, because I'm not swearing in this army. And I wrote you a letter telling you why. They took me in the back to Captain Cox, who was running the base at that time, and he declared me a security risk and sent me home. So I never did hear no more back from them until they sent Army intelligence agents after me later on. But that was before Muhammad Ali's case. His case was 66, mine was 65. And I think what happened was the whole anti-war movement was divided into 2 parts. One section that put on backward collars and claimed they was preachers, and the other section that just got up and ran the candidate. Well, you know, that's the left and the right. Well, we didn't play either one. We went right down the middle. I believe in fighting, but not this war, and I ain't going. And we were victorious on that stand, so we got out of that. So anyway, that was my little story with my experience with the draft. But in talking about the history of this city, I think the most significant event of the city that took place in the last 100 years is the 1967 rebellion. I want to say a couple of things about these posters up here. This little poster here was from the U.S. Social Forum in 2010, where 20,000 people came from across the country into a social forum for a week downtown Detroit, and they selected drum as the main struggle they wanted to promote, and that's the social forum poster right there. The big one is the drum slate that I'll talk about in a few minutes. But this 1967 rebellion, and I think the definitive work on the 1967 rebellion is a book called Violence in the Model Cities by Sidney Fine. And it's a Bible on the rebellion. And anybody that want to know anything about the rebellion need to read Sidney Fine's book. It's an excellent piece. But he talks about how the rebellion broke out. The rebellion started like all the rebellions across the country started in the 60s, usually a battle between the police department and the black community. Always the same situation. Every city you want to look into that had an explosion exploded the same way. To give you an example, the 1966 rebellion in Detroit that we had on Kercheval in Pennsylvania was started pretty much because, you know, anybody got a real history of Detroit, you know about the Big Four? We had the Big Four, which was 4 big white police officers that rode in a big four-door DeSoto that used to ride around intimidating the black community all the time. We call them the Big Four. Well, the Big Four rode around the corner on Pennsylvania, as usual. There's a group of about 6 blacks on the corner. They holler out, "Go home." Well, the guys on the corner say, "You go home. We already at home." You know, so the police say, "Well, don't be here when we get back." People on the corner say, "Don't leave. You know, we ain't gonna wait for you to come back. Come on." So the police ride away and they come back with 5 other carloads of police and they jump out and the fight starts and it spreads. That's the way Cursiville began, and they call out the tactical mobile unit and people and the neighborhood rises up and the police kowtow everybody back in place. Same thing happened in 67, but 67 was different because in 67 they raided a blind pig that had 150 people in it. And it was on 12th Street, not on the east side. Now, I want to dispel some of this notion about a blind pig. Most people know what blind pigs are, don't they? Well, I don't know. You know, I talk to young people a lot of times that don't know much about some of these things. But, you know, at that time, when you worked inside the auto plant, you know, we were working 12/7. The afternoon shift used to start at 5. We didn't get off till 3 o'clock in the morning. And all the bars and things in the city of Detroit closed at 2. So when you got off work at 3 o'clock in the morning, you had to get a drink somewhere. And almost every block in most of the neighborhoods had a blind pig or after-hour joint, however you want to call it, that was open and available. And we used to go there regularly. I was working afternoon shift. In no way I was going home after making all them cars all day long at 3 o'clock without getting a drink. And so you would go to these blind pigs, and they were just actually a part of the neighborhood. Even though they weren't legal, they didn't have no liquor with a label on it. All the liquor they had was homebrew they had made in the bathtub, and moonshine that they had made, fry some chicken, and put some music on, and you got an after-hour joint. And we used to go to these places every weekend, especially on Friday and Saturday night. That was part of the culture of our life. And everybody knew it. The plants knew it. The police knew it. Everybody, you know, profited from these little blind pigs. It just so happened on that one day in 1967, when they raided that blind pig, they had to call out 2 big buses to arrest all the people that was in the blind pig because they had about 100 and some people in there. And by the time the buses got back, people that rallied on the street and started bricking the police, and the rebellion was on. And that rebellion was the biggest rebellion in American history prior to that. I think the Watts Rebellion after Rodney King went further than that, but until that point, the Detroit Rebellion in 67 was the largest in U.S. history. And I want to say a couple of things about that. There's some things that distinguish the Detroit Rebellion from all the rest of the rebellions. First of all, the Detroit Rebellion was integrated. Blacks and whites were looting and sniping together. And every book you read on the Detroit Rebellion is going to explain the integrated nature of this Detroit Rebellion, especially over there on Trumbull and Forest and that area where everybody was going up and down Grand River taking all the stuff out the stores. The second thing was that in the Detroit Rebellion, you know, we had an assassination within the rebellion, and that's the assassination that's referred to as the Algiers Motel Incident. And the Algiers Motel Incident is a book written by John Hershey called the Algiers Motel Incident. And that's the incident at the Algiers Motel where these 3 white police officers assassinated these 3 young black guys for being with 2 white girls in that Algiers Motel. Now, the Algiers Motel is wiped off the face of the earth and ain't there no more. The book, John Hershey's book, if you go to Detroit Public Schools in the library, it's gone. You can't find it. They done wiped out the history of this thing. You don't know nothing about it unless somebody tells you. John Hershey wrote the book on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's still sitting in the library. But not the Algiers Motel Incident. You can't hardly get your hands on it. The third thing about it was the amount of people that was arrested in the Detroit Rebellion. They arrested over 7,000 people in the Detroit Rebellion. They arrested so many people that they filled up all the penitentiaries in Michigan. They sent us to Milan, Marquette, all over the place, Jackson, Ionia. I ended up doing 15 days in Ionia State Penitentiary for violation of curfew on the first night. But they arrested so many people that they even arrested people on Belle Isle. See, Belle Isle that you thought was your little island where you go and party and barbecue and stuff on the weekend. Well, that became a jail. They arrested over 500 people on Belle Isle. Matter of fact, we renamed it. We started calling it Belcatraz, after Alcatraz, you know, the island in the famous prison island out of San Francisco. But all these people was arrested and held in these places until they went to trial. The fourth thing was the amount of ammunition that was fired. Now, Sidney Fine got all this in his book. Listen, the amount, for some reason, they got a way to know how many rounds of ammunition was fired. Over 200,000 rounds of ammunition was fired by the National Guard and the state troopers in the city. They shot up the city. They shot up everything in the city. Little 4-year-old Tanya Blonding was shot and killed through the floor on Euclid and 12th Street with a 50 caliber machine gun. The 82nd Airborne and 101st Airborne only shot 25 times because they were trained troops. Many of them was minorities. They didn't panic under circumstances, you know. We had so many empty shell casings around the city that when the rebellion was over, we picked them up, recased them, drilled a hole in the top and put a rawhide string around them and wore them as necklaces, you know, in response to the rebellion. So everybody that broke out of them jails came out with the afros that high and these big 50 caliber bullets hanging around their necks, you know, as a symbol of the rebellion. The rebellion changed people. People that were ambivalent about the police department before the rebellion was convinced when it was over. You didn't have to argue to nobody about whether or not they had some hatred for the police. They all hated them, you know, and that's the conditions that came out of the rebellion in a lot of ways. But one of the things we learned during the rebellion that led to us organizing in the plants was the fact that when they imposed curfew in this city, if you got hungry, you couldn't go get no food. If you got sick, you couldn't go to the hospital. But if you had a badge from Chrysler, Ford, General Motors, and one of the big three, you get through the police line, the Army line, the National Guard line, the state trooper line to take your butt to work. And we sit down and summon this thing up, and we made the fundamental calculation that the only place that black people had any value in society was at the point of production. And after that, we stopped and started our work towards organizing inside this factory. And less than a year later, Drum was born at the Dodge main plant, and then it spread to the rest of the factories. So that's the history of the way this thing went. That's why we turn our efforts towards organizing in the factory. That's our learning experience up to that point. We had so many difficulties inside the shop. Let me tell you just other few stories about the shop. When I got to Iona State Penitentiary, my cell block looked like the assembly line. I had so many people that was off that Dodge main assembly line that was arrested, and I was arrested for curfew the first night, that it looked like the assembly line up and down my cell block. And because it was factory workers and ordinary daily people that was arrested in this 7,000. It wasn't people on the street. I had a friend, I like to tell the story oftentimes, that I went to high school with, and he was a booster. He was good for 3 suits a day out of Hudson's, you know. That was his livelihood. He stole every day, and he was good for 3 suits. So I'm over in the 10th precinct. I'm locked up in the garage, and about 1 o'clock in the morning, I look up, and they got him. They done locked him up, and I'm talking. I said, hey, listen, man, what happened to you? He said, listen, I was out there in the morning when the rebellion first started, and I saw people breaking in places, taking stuff in the pawn shop and stuff. And I said, this not going to last. I mean, that's just not the way to steal. You don't steal stuff like that. That ain't the way you do it. You know? So he said it took him half a day to finally get a nerve. He said people still running in, taking everything. He ain't got started yet. He finally got started. He said he was so chicken. The first place he went in, he came out with a bottle of pop and a bag of potato chips. He said he finally got loose, started stealing everything, won't nail down. They caught him and arrested him for loot. But I just want to tell you a story because it won't necessarily the people you think that was in this rebellion, because that's just not the way things happen. You know, during the rebellion, I don't know if people today use the pawn shop like we used to, you know, but they didn't have no credit back in the 60s. So you couldn't get credit no way. I think the black folks could get credit for Willis Willing Mills and state samples or something. That's about the only place you get credit. So everybody got to live off the pawn shops. I mean, you buy something on Friday when you get paid, or by Wednesday you got to pawn it. They have enough money to get through the rest of the week. So everybody has something in the pawn shop. And if you ever look at the pawn shop slip, on the back of it in great big letters, it says, "Not responsible for fire, theft, and other unavoidable accidents." And the rebellion was all of those. It was fire, it was theft, it was unavoidable. So the first things that got busted was the pawn shops. Early that morning, people at 12th Street had about 4 pawn shops up and down 12th between the Boulevard and Claremont. All those pawn shops got hit first. Just went in and most people went in there trying to find their own stuff, but took other things on their way out. But anyway, I just tried to give you a little history, a sense of what in these rebellions, the kind of things that take place. So that was the rebellion in '67. Now, I'm losing people, I guess. Y'all got to go to class. I'm sorry, guys. People, I couldn't do no better. But at the Dodge main plant, we decided. Wait. No, I think it'll stay there. We decided. We started having strikes at Dodge main plant, and there hadn't been some strikes there in about 13 years prior to that. But the line, they were speeding up the line so fast, that people just decided to walk out. Everybody was in the hole. Do you know what in the hole is? No. This sister here does, but when you're working in a assembly line, you got a space. You got probably this much space to do your job in, and when you get behind, you're way down there in somebody else's space. Well, the whole line was in the hole because the line was running too fast, we just couldn't keep up. And so everybody started talking. They said, "Well, look, we're going out at lunchtime. We're not coming back." And so that's what happened. Now, on a Thursday night, we went out at lunchtime, and we didn't come back in after lunch. And the labor relations supervisors and all these people came downstairs and started demanding that we come back in. We told them we weren't coming in. We ended up with about 300 people out of the shop. That's enough to close the whole shop down. They sent the rest of the workers home. We drafted a little committee and decided to come out on the day shift in the morning and keep the day shift out and explain to them the problems that we had, and we've done that. And this little wildcat strike went on for about 4 days. It's a wildcat strike because we ain't had no authority. Matter of fact, the chicken union officials jumped up and ran off to a conference in Buffalo. So they couldn't interfere. So we was out for about 4 days, on a wildcat strike. And when we finally went back to work, they called a bunch of us into the office and told us that we had been tentatively identified as participants in an unauthorized work stoppage, and we would be disciplined up to and including discharge based on further investigation. So I knew I was going to get fired because I had too much reputation already in the plant. And then when the labor rep came down and started begging us to come in, I was the loudest one out there. We ain't coming back nowhere. You hadn't been to speeding the line up in the beginning. Blah, 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 blah. So I know I'm going to get fired because that's the way you do. You get the loud mouth first. So what happened was that when it came back, they fired 7 of us and gave about 35 people time off. Well, they fired me and a guy named Benny Tate and 5 other whites. What they did was they ended up bringing the 5 whites back, left me and Benny Tate out. Now listen, the leaders of the strike actually that night was these white workers that wanted to walk out. We knew that. We had no problem with them. And we were united in our effort because the speed up line was whooping everybody. But it was the deal that they made that was the cross. Why are you going to leave me and Benny out and not nobody else? So it was based on that we decided that we needed an organization in this plant. And we decided, since we worked at the Hamtramck Assembly Plant and we made Dodges, that we would call this thing the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, DRUM. And that's where DRUM came from. We discovered during this wildcat strike that the people way over on the Cornet side didn't have the iota of understanding of why we were out, because we were on the Joseph Copple side. It was 10,000 people that worked at Dodge Main. It was not, the communication gap wasn't there. We weren't in solidarity. So we decided that what we would do, that we would get together and we'd print a little newsletter. And I got a couple of samples of them stuck up on that board in the back. And we'd get together and we'd print this little newsletter and we'd pass it out. And that way we could start uniting the whole plant around the same issues. And we passed out the first one. It went over, it was huge. I mean, workers was looking for them everywhere, trying to find the next one and stuff like that. So we decided that what we'd do, we'd print it once a week. Now, what happened after that first week, they started harassing people. They started passing them out. So we had these young kids, the high school kids. They came forward and they said, listen, we will pass out these leaflets for you. We don't work there. They can take our picture all day long. They can't fire me because I don't work there. So every Tuesday, we had this core of about 10 of these young kids, and we had to go meet with their mamas and dads, get permission, and we'd pick them up every Tuesday, go out to the plant, and distribute these flyers. So we owe the whole basis of our movement to these young people, because without them, we couldn't have grown like we did. And the women that did the typesetting and stuff that we had access. So we had a local newspaper called the Inner City Voice. And so we had staff. We had my wife and a lot of other people that did the typesetting. And we had mimeograph machines that were popular at that day. Ain't like today. You tell somebody about a mimeograph machine, and they don't know what you're talking about. But at that time, it was the lifeblood of the movement was these old mimeograph machines. And we would put out about 5,000 of those drums every Monday. We'd meet on Sunday, write it. We would print it up on Monday. We'd pass it out on Tuesday morning, and that was our MO. That was our modus operandi, and it worked. People were waiting on the thing every Tuesday. We could not afford to be late, they just sucked it up. And after agitating about 9 weeks, people started demanding that you do something. Well, listen, y'all talking all this stuff. What you gonna do? So we obviously didn't want to move to the level of striking that whole shop. So we decided that we'd have a couple of little actions, go down to the executive board at the local and give them some demands. And the demands that we wrote up came out of the leaflets that we put out those other earlier 9 weeks. And that didn't work, but we got down there and one of our guys got excited and called for a strike the next morning. All out of kilter, it wasn't supposed to, he got excited, couldn't help it. Once he called for strike, everybody said yay and left. So now we're stuck. How are we gonna do this? We gotta strike them in the morning. We had a little coffee shop called the Ghetto Coffee Shop where we had chess players and conga drums that used to hang out all night. So we went back to the office, we wrote up some picket signs, we got everybody out of the little coffee shop that hung out and took them out to the picket line with us. They even took the conga drums. And they climbed up on the gates at Dodge Main and started beating the conga drums, and in a half hour we had about 3,000 to 4,000 workers backed up on the street that refused to go to work, and the strike was on. That strike lasted another 4 days. Chrysler Corporation declared the strike to be extra legal instead of illegal. And because they declared it to be extra legal, nobody got discharged. Now I was already fired. I was gone from in May when I got fired. So by the time we got to August, I was already gone. But what happened was that movement grew. The word got out about that movement, and people came from everywhere. They wanted to build them a ROM. We call them ROMs because, it was the Eldon, L-ROM, J-ROM, CAD-ROM, 4-ROM, all of them Revolutionary Union movements. And we couldn't control those movements. The lesson I like to draw out of that is always a difference between a movement and an organization. A movement breaks out spontaneously, and it breaks out on its own. Organizations are always running around, trying to catch up with these movements. All we would tell everybody that came to us was that, listen, we got paper, we got ink. We got machines that can run your flyer off. We got a group of young kids that will help you distribute it. I'm not going in your plant. I don't know what's going on in there. You all got to handle that. You sit down, you write up what's in your plant, what you want us to print. We will do that, and that's the way the movement grew. It just grew expeditiously. All over these plants, people wanted. And then the young kids, they were seeing what we were doing inside the plant. They said, oh, we're going to organize the schools. So they started organizing. They told so many stories about them. They talked about them principals so bad that they just rallied all the kids, around these issues at the school, and that thing just grew. When we had that anniversary, they gave us the sheets they had back. They said they had organized groups at 13 high schools, 9 junior highs, and 2 elementaries. They were showing us applications they had from 9-year-old kids in the elementary school trying to join the little student movement. So the thing just grew. And that was the basis for Drum and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers growing like it did. There's 1,000 other stories about some of the stuff we've done. Obviously, I got blacklisted out of the auto industry. And they had injunctions on me that we couldn't be caught 100 feet from the gate of any Chrysler plant on the globe. It's ridiculous. They had it actually wrote on the injunction, on the globe. Like we're going to go to South Africa and strike a Chrysler plant or something. Anyway, what happened, I had to go out. I went out and got me a new name, a new social security number, and got in line at Ford and got me another job. Everybody called me Big Ab, and I found out through our contract that falsification of application will get you discharged if they catch you within 12 months. But if you get past 12 months, then you're okay. So I went in and I shut up, I wouldn't speak to nobody. You know how you act like you done got old and sedity. You see people you used to know, don't know who to trust. So I just wouldn't speak to nobody. Just went in and worked and come on back home. Wouldn't go nowhere near no union meeting, and just did that. I did that for 19 months. After 19 months, somebody snitched on me anyway. They called me into the office, and I get into the labor rep's office, and this guy got a stack of pictures of me like this, that he done got from Chrysler. They said they done collected all my employment application and done a detailed handwriting analysis, and they want me off plant property immediately. So they discharged me. Hey, how you doing? Okay, yeah. They discharged me from Ford. So I had to go through the grievance procedure, and I was lucky enough. I had an old guy on that picture back there named Dave Moore, who had came out of the struggles in the 30s, and he was the guy that was arguing my case before the Empire. And when I went before the Empire, Ford Motor Company had the guy ahead of its North American operations sitting at my Empire. They had a battery of attorneys, and all they had was me, my wife at the time, and Dave Moore, and we prevailed. I won my job and my seniority, but no back pay. So we accepted that. I mean, I was in the street 16 months waiting for my case to go to the hearing, so I couldn't get the 16 months back pay. But I went on back with my job. I got my name back. Now, I used to be Alexander Ware. That's the name I hired in under. So I got my General Baker name back. So I went on back to work like that. And then that's the only reason I was able to retire from Ford Motor Company in 2003 with 29.6 years of seniority. I worked 40 years in the industry, but I got fired so many times I couldn't collect all that time. I got fired 3 times from Ford, twice from Chrysler. But that's the pains we paid learning the struggle itself. So we didn't learn it by book learning, we learned it by practical experience. So that's our story. That's the story of what Drum was about. That's the story of my life and its unfolding in the city of Detroit. And it's a lot of more information that ain't on the table yet. We've done an awful lot of things, but I'm just giving you the highlights. Thank you.